Welcome to the Cultivation Cast by Black Dog LED with Kevin and Noah. In this podcast series, we will cover all things related to indoor cannabis cultivation. So today on the Cultivation Cast, we're going to cover leaf surface temperature and how that applies to our lights. There's a whole history there that we'll dive into. We're going to cover the history of how we stumbled across the leaf surface temperature and how our lights, the Black Dog lights, affect that leaf surface temperature, and then what we've learned to do to accommodate that change in the leaf surface temperature due to our lights and more specifically our spectrum. So we'll start a little bit with the history of leaf surface temperature and how we even stumbled across it, because it's something we weren't aware that our lights would necessarily change, but thanks to feedback from customers and tests we were doing internally, we realized we had some issues. So Kevin's going to jump in and talk to you about how we stumbled and how we did the initial research on leaf surface temperature, which has been published in both Max Yield and High Times magazine over the last couple of years.
Yeah, so for many years we've been growing with our own lights and doing test grows, and we were getting pretty good results out of some of our test grows, even though the test grows weren't necessarily always optimal in terms of environmental control. And we were having customers that were trying to use our lights and not getting the same results that we were. And after extensive talking with the people to try and figure out what was going on there, we started identifying that one of the major differences between how we were growing and how our customers was growing are that a lot of our customers had really nice lockdown environments where they were keeping everything nice and cool, about 75 degrees, because that's what they had previously done with their cannabis grows, and that's what had worked best for them. And everyone knows that you should keep your cannabis plants about 75 degrees under high pressure sodium lights to get the best results. So when they were doing that with our LEDs, they weren't getting the yields that we were when we were running grows that we just didn't have time to put the air conditioner into, because honestly, we never saw a reason to. We were getting such good results without putting the air conditioner in the grow and just letting it get up to 85, 90 degrees. So we actually went out and bought a forward-looking infrared camera to see if we could actually see what was going on here. And that led to research, which is published on our website now at blackdogled.com/LST for leaf surface temperature. And you can see we've got forward-looking infrared camera pictures of the same set of plants on the same day under various different kinds of lights in the same room, same ambient conditions, tried to keep everything the same as much as possible. And you can see that the spectrum of light that the plants are put under actually affects how their leaves are temperature-wise, even with the temperature in the room, the ambient air temperature in the room being the same. And it turns out that by optimizing the spectrum for what chlorophyll can most easily and readily absorb, we had been putting out a spectrum of light which wasn't heating the leaves up. And it turns out that high-pressure sodium, and even natural sunlight for that matter, puts out light which the plant can use, but it actually heats the leaves up in the process and gets the plant to be at its optimal self temperature, its optimal metabolic temperature when the ambient air temperature is about 75 degrees Fahrenheit, and to get the leaves themselves to be the same temperature under our light spectrum, which I'll get into the specific colors that are involved in a minute, but under our phytogenesis spectrum, to get the same leaf temperature, we actually have to raise the ambient air temperature about 10 degrees. So by advising our customers to raise the ambient temperature in their grow up to 85 degrees, that's when they were starting to be able to see the yields and the results that we were getting with our lights. So it's been an interesting discovery process. As Noah said, we've been figured this out about 5 years ago and have been moving forward with it since. And there's a lot of interesting side effects and questions as involved with raising the ambient air temperature 10 degrees, and we can get into those as well.
You know, we should actually probably for the listeners is go back real quickly, and you mentioned something that made me think about what is leaf surface temperature, and you talked about the forward-looking infrared camera. And so for the listeners out there that aren't really familiar with it, the easiest way I like to explain it is if you consider this, when you're a kid and you got sick and your mom stuck a temperature or a thermometer underneath your tongue, or maybe modern days they're putting it in your ear, they're taking your core body temperature. Plants don't have a tongue or an ear to stick something in. So for the plants, the leaf surface temperature is their core body temperature, if you want to think of it that way. It is the critical way to measure their temperature. So when we're talking about leaf surface temperature, we're really not talking about just the leaves. We're talking about the plant itself.
Right. And just to add to that, the leaves themselves are where the metabolism, the actual life functioning chemistry of the plant is going on, at least while it's being exposed to light. And so that's where you want the temperature to be ideal for those chemical reactions to proceed at an ideal rate.
And as Kevin alluded to, we've done a lot of playing around, and we've grown well even beyond our recommended temperatures. We always get growers, they're rather surprised by the recommended temperatures, because we all grew under HPS before, and we know 80s, that's crazy, and if you do, you got to have high CO2 and all that. But when we recommend 88, we get a lot of pushback, and we explain, look, we've been growing this way for years. We can swear by it. We don't get heat stress on the plants. The plants are incredibly healthy, and mistakenly, we've grown into the 90s with our lights and also seen no heat stress, and the plants are actually quite healthy. So we're comfortable giving this recommendation. We're certainly not giving recommendations out that we have concerns would actually hurt the plants in your garden.
And indeed, one of the problems that we do run into is reluctance, and it's definitely understandable. I have personally killed plants before when the temperatures in my grow room got up to 88 degrees, and you come home and everything's dead under your high pressure sodium lights, and that's not a good thing. So when we advise people that they're growing too cold and you need to turn the temperature up to 85, 88 degrees, there's an understandable reluctance, especially among experienced growers that have personally killed plants that way before. And so it's difficult sometimes getting people to even try it. But once we can get people to try it and see for themselves that, hey, not only does it not hurt the plants, but that's actually how we get the high yields with our lights, that's when people can really see for themselves. One of the important side effects of turning up the temperature in your grow room is that you actually need to ventilate a lot less, whether that's being done with a cooling apparatus such as an air conditioner, a mini split or something in your grow room, or ventilation, just pulling in outside air. Because we're able to run so much warmer in the grow room, your need for cooling, whether through air conditioning or ventilation, is dramatically reduced. And if you're, for example, supplementing CO2, that means a lot less wasted CO2 if you're ventilating. And for air conditioning, it means you're running the air conditioning a lot less. But there are a lot of questions about running it and growing at higher temperatures, and there's an understandable reluctance because so many people have had bad experiences with it in the past to even try it. And people, for example, we get a question all the time of, okay, well, won't running at a warmer temperature cause insects to explode in my grow environment? And the answer, in short, is no, because the insects are also affected by the temperature that they're actually being reproducing in. And that's why growers have noticed that if you decrease the temperature in your grow room, you can slow down an insect infestation. But the insects themselves are actually basically the temperature of the leaf that they are living on. So if you are running with a 10-degree warmer grow room, as we recommend with our lights, the leaves themselves of the plants are actually going to be the same temperature as they would be in a 75-degree grow room under high-pressure sodium lights. And that's where the forward-looking infrared camera really comes into play, because unlike our bodies, where you can stick a thermometer anywhere inside of us and get a decent idea of what our core temperature is, as Noah just alluded to, with plants, with the leaves being so thin, the temperature actually varies significantly, even from one end of the leaf to another. And we've had a lot of customers that are trying to use these infrared spot thermometers that you just aim at a single spot and it tells you what the temperature is at that spot. But unfortunately, that literally is giving you an incomplete picture of what the leaf temperature is on the plants. When you look at the forward-looking infrared camera pictures that we've got of plants up on our website, you can see just how much variation there is, not just between different leaves on the plant, but within a single leaf, there can be a 10 or 20 degree differential in temperature. And that's where only by looking at entire pictures of entire plants and comparing one, that's lit with high-pressure pressure sodium versus one that's lit with our LED spectrum, that you can actually see and get a complete picture overall of how the plant as a whole is being affected. So there's a number of different things that we believe are going into the effect on the actual leaf temperature. And when we ran the experiment, we're checking to make sure that we're getting similar levels of illumination, similar PAR levels, so the plants are getting bombarded by the same number of photons. The difference is that with high pressure sodium, the spectrum is got quite a bit in the far infrared range, above 800 nanometers, which is generally not even shown on spectrum graphs for plant lights, at least, because it's not useful for plant growth. It's basically just pure heat that's being beamed down onto your plants. But that's why when you get under a high pressure sodium light, it feels so warm. They're putting off a lot of infrared light, same thing that incandescent heat lamps in buffet lines do to keep food warm. And so the high pressure sodium lights are actually just kind of acting like heat lamps over your plants all the time, warming them up. However, when we tested white LEDs, basically LEDs that are sometimes marketed as full spectrum LEDs, they're LEDs that are designed for human eyes, and the peak of their spectral output is in the yellow-green area of the spectrum where our eyes are most efficient at picking up light. We did see a difference between the leaf surface temperature under a white LED spectrum compared to our plant optimized spectrum. And while it wasn't as dramatic a difference as high pressure sodium, and we relate that to the fact that the white LEDs don't have the massive amount of infrared that the high pressure sodium spectrum has, plants are just not as efficient at using yellow and green light as they are at using blue and red light. And it's not that they can't use yellow and green light for photosynthesis. In fact, there have been a lot of studies out there that have shown that yellow and green light are actually very good at driving photosynthesis. It just turns out that yellow and green light actually cause the leaves to heat up more in the process of photosynthesizing than red and blue light does. And I could go on for half an hour about how different scientific studies have shown in the past that, chlorophyll really only absorbs red and blue. And so how is it that plants are growing with these high pressure sodium lights that are mostly yellow and green? And basically it comes down to the chlorophyll is not what's capturing the yellow and green light. It's a different molecule in the leaf, which is stealing a little bit of energy from those yellow and green photons, degrading them to red photons that the chlorophyll can then actually use for photosynthesis. So those yellow and green photons are not wasted, but the energy that's stolen from them ends up in the leaf as heat, and that's warming up the leaf itself, and that is actually contributing somewhat to a lot of these scientific studies that were done decades ago in many respects, or in many circumstances, where when they were examining what colors of light plants are using and which ones are most efficient for photosynthesis, they were ignoring leaf surface temperature and actually what the temperature of the leaf was. So whether or not they actually controlled for leaf temperature, in fact, they didn't. They weren't necessarily aware, but by aiming yellow and green light at the leaves, they might have been warming up the leaf, and that might have had just as much effect on the efficiency of its metabolism as actually the color of light that they were putting on it. So it raises all sorts of questions, and I'm not saying that we have all of the answers by any means, but we have a lot of experience and thousands of customers with experience now running at 10 degrees warmer with our lights and getting better results than they ever got with high pressure sodium at 75 to 78 degrees.
And that's a good point. With all those customers out there, one of the questions we get in addition to the pushback is, well, what happens if I do grow at my traditional, HPS type temperatures with your LED? And certainly, as Kevin said, it's not going to hurt the plant. What you're going to do is slow down the metabolism, and it will hurt your yields. The quality will be on point, but you will get lower yields. How much? Well, that depends on the plant and your exact environment and things like that. But we've seen 10 and up to 20% decrease in yields potentially from running lower temperatures down in the 70s like you would more traditionally run with HPS.
And basically, it comes down to another way of asking the question of, well, can't I just run your lights at 75 degrees would be, from the plant's point of view, that would be the same as running with your high pressure sodium lights at 65 degrees. So what happens if you do that? I think most growers would know that that's a little too cold and something is going to happen. And that something is you're slowing down the plant's metabolism, not keeping it warm enough to grow as actively as it could. And that ends up affecting your yield negatively.
Yeah, and that is a good indicator that you are running too cool. One of our key things that let us know that we were going down the right path is we did notice our plants weren't drinking and cycling quite as quickly as we wanted. You know, as cannabis growers, we want to get newts on there. We want to get them to cycle through each feeding cycle to the next one. And we were moving slower. So if you're running lower, you would see slight reduction in your ability to get fresh nutrients on there. Your dry time is going to be a little bit longer than you want generally. You know, we try to shoot for every 2 to 3 days. And when we were running lower temps, we might have been 4 or 5 days. And to us, that's not really an optimal setup for a grow environment, at least with soil. Hydro, of course, being different.
Yeah, and there's all sorts of questions. Everyone is understandably nervous the first time we try and convince them to run 10 degrees warmer, basically in a temperature that they know they've had problems running before. And so it's difficult to convince people to try it the first time. And we get questions about, well, you know, insects, and what about relative humidity, and what about the soil temperature? Isn't the soil going to be too warm? And basically the answer on all of those is no. And it's because everything is relative to the actual temperature of the plant, not the air that it's in. We can walk into a grow room and we feel the temperature of the ambient air on our skin, but we can't see the actual temperature of the plants. So even from a tactile perspective, it's difficult for us as humans to walk in and see what the plants are really feeling with the environment they're in.
Yeah, it's a question we get all the time is how are the growers going to like it? And it definitely depends where you're from and what your body's like. We have some growers that love the 88 degree or 84 degree without CO2, and we have some that definitely think that's warm to work in. You know, I'm from Phoenix, so the 88 to me feels downright nice, but I guess it does depend where you come from. So that is something to take into consideration when you're thinking about your garden.
But I mean, for every commercial grow where we've been able to independently track the air conditioning usage just based on turning up the thermostat setting 10 degrees. So instead of running at 78 degrees, running at 88 degrees with our light and our light spectrum, we've been able to cut the power usage for the HVAC system by about 60% or more in every commercial grow that we've been able to independently track that in. So this 10 degree thermostat setting difference is not something small. Overall, it ends up cutting the electrical usage, and this varies depending on the amount of insulation in the walls of your building and how warm the temperature is outside, and even seasonal variations. But overall, can actually reduce electrical usage by about half when you consider the lights and the HVAC in their entirety as one electrical use. So it's a huge savings. And while we point at our lights and can show that they're 20% more efficient than a double-ended high-pressure sodium, where the real electrical savings actually comes in is in the decreased cooling requirements from running your room 10 degrees warmer with a plant-optimized spectrum.
Yeah, and we should probably speak a little bit to the temperature thing, because, you know, we're sitting here talking to you about running 88 degree temperatures with CO2 and, you know, 84 without. And we get people, especially in the colder states up in Alaska or whatever, that'll ask us, say, well, you know, LEDs create no heat, so how am I going to get my place warm? And we're definitely here to tell you that if you put a 1,050 watt light of ours, you put the Phytomax 21000 into your grow, or in a commercial grow, you have 20 or 40 or 80 or 100 of those in a single room, trust us, you will need cooling. You will need to evacuate some heat. LEDs do create heat. There's nothing anyone can do to get around that. But so people are concerned, how do I get to 88 if I'm running LEDs? That seems weird. But trust us, if you have a closed up, properly sealed tent or a grow room or environment, you'll have no problem once your lights are on attaining the proper temperatures. And as a matter of fact, you will, under most conditions, still need to at least remove some heat, if not actually use air conditioning. Obviously, in a tent, you can just remove heat, and in a large grow room, you're going to need to employ air conditioning of some kind.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's simple physics. Doesn't matter what it's going into. 1 watt will generate 3.41 BTUs of heat, whether it's going into our light or a high-pressure sodium light or a electric toothbrush. it's all the same. It's simple physics. The difference is with high pressure sodium, they're generating a lot of heat to begin with to heat things up enough to start glowing and give off light. And so a lot of the energy output of high pressure sodium is in the form of infrared light, which we perceive as heat. Whereas with our LEDs, we put out mostly visible light and ultraviolet light. But when that light hits something in the room, it warms up that surface that it hits, and ultimately physics dictates that it's all going to be a wash. It's all going to be the same. 1 watt is 3.41 BTUs, no matter what it goes into. So our lights will still warm up your growing area, but because they're a little bit more efficient to get the same amount of light out, they warm up your growing area a little bit less than high pressure sodium do. But then because we are spectrally optimizing the actual light that we're giving the plants so that it doesn't warm up the plants themselves, that 10-degree increase in your thermostat setting is where you get the real cooling savings. It's not necessarily that we're cutting the amount of heat going into your grow by 50%. It's that we're cutting the need to cool it by about 50%.
Good point.
So one of the other questions we get from growers all the time too is, well, won't this change how I water, or will I need to water more often or less often? And the answer is, if you're doing it right, it actually won't change what you're doing, because the goal is to keep the plant itself at the same temperature under our light spectrum that it would be under high pressure sodium light at 75 or 78 degrees. And from our experimentation, that means that on average, the warmest parts on the leaves are going to be about 88 degrees Fahrenheit. And again, that's where you can go look at these forward-looking infrared camera pictures we've got showing you the cannabis plants at 75 degrees under high-pressure sodium. The warmest parts of the leaves are about 88 to 90 degrees. That's where the optimal metabolic range is. Now, I didn't say every leaf needs to be 88 or 90 degrees. Again, if you look at the pictures, you'll see it's a very patchy, it's messy, but on average, the plants you want to be the same temperature under high pressure sodium at 75 degrees, or to get the same temperature for the whole plant at 85 degrees under our lights. Now, how does that affect watering? You'd think you're running warmer, that's going to dry out the plants more. Well, no, not if the plant itself is the same temperature. So let's say the whole plant is 88 degrees under high pressure sodium at 75 degrees ambient room temperature. The plant is what is evaporating water out of its leaves into the environment. And by running the different temperature, but keeping the plant itself at the same temperature under our lights, the same amount of evaporation is happening. And people ask questions about vapor pressure deficit, and we could go into a whole nother episode about that because it gets complicated. And the basic answer is the vapor pressure deficit shouldn't change either. You should have the same difference in vapor pressure deficit between the plant's leaves and between the ambient air temperature. The only difference being the actual difference in ambient air temperature if you're keeping the plant temperature the same with the VPD charts, but because relative humidity is relative to temperature, it's the same relative humidity in your 85 degree grow room. So if you're currently running at 50% humidity with high pressure sodium lights at 75 degrees, with our lights, you'd want to run at 50% relative humidity, but at 85 degrees under our lights to get the plant itself to be at the same temperature, drinking as fast, evaporating just as fast as it would under your high pressure sodium lights. And if you do that right and you increase the temperature to get the plant to be the same temperature, it's going to drink exactly the same speed as it would under the high pressure sodium lights. And in fact, by running cooler, you're actually not going to have the plant drink as much, and because of that, you're not able to get it enough nutrients, and because of that, that just further decreases your yield. So by not running warmer with our lights, you actually are shooting yourself in the foot, both in terms of temperature as well as the ability to get nutrients into the plants. So I mentioned before that we had done a test with white LED spectrum and looking at the leaf surface temperature as well. And in fact, I think some of our competitors out there have actually taken notice of what we're recommending, and now they're turning that around and saying, oh, well, you need the yellow light to help warm up the plant's leaves. And they're not necessarily incorrect. If you're running at a cold temperature, then you need something to warm up the plant's leaves. But in terms of how does it make sense to do it, we can either create yellow light that is less efficiently used by the plants and warms up their leaves, that then forces you to run your air conditioner to keep the room at 75 degrees, or we can create light that is more efficiently targeted at what the plants can efficiently utilize without warming up their leaves. Turn up the grow room thermostat to 85 degrees or even higher with CO2 supplementation and save 60% on your cooling bill. So it's not entirely incorrect to say that the yellow light is required to warm up the leaves, but another better way of looking at it is if you take out the excess of yellow light, then you get to enjoy a substantial savings on your cooling costs. And so why create all that excess yellow light to begin with? It's really ideal for human eyes, but not so much for plants. So there's an interesting change in the industry over the past 5 years or so, where various different LED grow light manufacturers are now starting to recommend warmer temperatures as they've noticed what we've been recommending and been trying it out themselves. And there's a distinct dichotomy between those that are using just white LEDs that are recommending slightly warmer temperatures than high pressure sodium, because the only difference is they aren't putting out a huge amount of infrared, but they're still putting out a very large excess of yellow light that's warming up the plant's leaves. And then there are other manufacturers that are targeting their spectrum more for what plants can actually efficiently absorb, and they tend to recommend 85, 86 degrees for their grows. So it's not just us that's saying this stuff anymore. Other LED grow light manufacturers have taken notice, and it doesn't take very long to run your own experiment and see for yourself just how much that change in ambient air temperature in your grow actually affects your yield, and how much getting it right is really important. And then once you get over the initial scariness of running at a temperature that under high pressure sodium would have killed your plants, you can see just how much easier it is with LED grow lights. And I think Noah had mentioned that we've had excursions before where our grow rooms got up past 90 degrees, even had excursions where they were up over 100 degrees, and we don't see damage, heat stress to the plants when we're getting up to 95 degrees. When we get up to 100, yeah, you're starting to see some signs of heat stress. But I've personally killed entire rooms full of plants before at 85, 88 degrees, just under high pressure sodium light. So it's a huge difference in the amount of tolerance for heat as well that we're seeing.
Yeah, and so one thing I'd like to recap, just because we get this question a lot, is we're not trying to push a lot of changes onto growers. We are not expert growers. We're good growers. We are experts at lighting for growing plants. And so what we try to tell people is, look, if you have something that works for you, you have a system, nutrients, whatever that works for you, please don't get a new LED grow light and change everything, because you won't know what the problem is. You'll have changed too many variables. The only thing we really want you to do is change your temperature and up that, but don't change your systems. People talk about running different nutrients and plants needing more. What was the one we always heard was potassium, more potassium. I mean,
which is a subject for a different podcast. But yeah, purple streaks in your stems are not a sign of nutrient deficiency under LED grow lights necessarily.
But we hear some interesting questions and theories. People talk about more watering, less watering, more newts, less newts, you name it. We've heard it. But you don't want to change those things. As Kevin said, if you're doing things properly, if you were doing them properly under HPS and you just change your lighting, all you should have to do is raise your temp and everything else should fall back in line, because as far as the plant's concerned, you're creating the identical environment to you had before. So don't get a new LED grow light and change everything you do because you heard this or heard that. If you get our LED grow light, then definitely raise the temperatures as we've guided. But other than that, stick with what you know and stick with what works for you. You can then experiment down the road as you kind of get used to the new lighting system.
Yeah, the ambient air temperature of the room is really the only thing we've identified that you really have to change, and you can't ignore it. We've had plenty of customers that get our lights, they still run at 75 degrees, and then they don't get the yield that we tell them they should expect off of their light. And that's why the only thing that you must change to get ideal results out of our lights is that warmer grow room temperature. And luckily for us, that's not something that costs you more. It's not something that's difficult to do. In fact, it's easier to run warmer, and it's cheaper to run warmer, and there's absolutely no reason reason other than bad experiences in the past with other lights where that temperature actually killed your plants, but we will guarantee that won't happen with our lights at 85 degrees.
Great. So thanks again for listening. Thanks for joining us on the Cultivation Cast. We do hope you enjoyed this installment. If you have any questions about the content or have ideas for a future topic, please send an email to podcast@blackdogled.com. Thanks again for joining us, and happy gardening.